It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this morning, Dr. Howard Fuller. Dr. Fuller is a distinguished professor of education and director of the Institute for the Transformation of Learning at Marquette University, and, is the former superintendent of the Milwaukee Public Schools, the nation's 15th largest urban district. During Dr. Fuller's 4-year tenure as superintendent, Milwaukee was recognized as among the most aggressive systems overhauling American urban education. A product of the Milwaukee Public Schools himself, Dr. Fuller and its tough housing projects, Dr. Fuller has had a non-traditional career path. During the 60s and early 70s, he organized hospital workers in North Carolina. In the 80s, he served as secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Employee Relations and dean of Milwaukee Area Technical College. In 1991, Dr. Fuller was appointed superintendent of the Milwaukee schools and became the catalyst for the reforms that swept Milwaukee classrooms. Featured in the April 17, 1995 edition of Business Week, Dr. Fuller was quoted as saying, "As I got older, I realized I couldn't change the world, so I decided to work on the lives of children. The struggle is to make sure all kids get the best education possible." This morning, Dr. Fuller will share his views on how to ensure that all the kids in the McClemons schools get the best education possible. Dr. Fuller, welcome to McClemons.
Thank you. Good morning. Let me begin my remarks this morning by thanking Superintendent Blanche Frazier for inviting me to be here with you. And I hope by the end of my remarks, she will still feel that it was a good idea. I want to also thank Dr. McGriff and Dr. Robinson for getting me here. They drove me here, and I could listen to 92.3 on the way down. So hey, what more could you ask for, in this world? But I really want to say a couple things. First of all, I want y'all to relax, kind of lay back, because this ain't going to be brief. Okay? Most speakers get up and they say, "This is going to be brief." I'm not going to be brief. I mean, this is the first time I got here. I may never get invited back. So I'm going to get it all in while I'm here. And I want to make it clear also, though, that my frame of reference for what I'm going to talk about is Milwaukee, is essentially large urban districts. And a lot of what I might say may not apply to a district your size and the situation you find yourself. And I just have to say that up front. But hopefully some of the ideas I'll set forward might strike a chord and might be of some use to you. Superintendent Frazier asked me to concentrate my talk on the needs of the urban learners. And I read an article that was sent around by Mike Boulis from the Middle Cities Education Association. The article was written by Belinda Williams and Ella McComb, and it's entitled "Building on the Strengths of Urban Learners." They make the case that there are 4 assumptions that need to be kept in mind when dealing with urban learners. Number 1, that culture and cognitive development are interrelated. Number 2, that education must foster the full potential of every learner by appreciating group membership and individual diversity. Number 3, that all educational systems must value and care for the learner and the community. And finally, that all individuals, both learners and facilitators of learning. In all honesty, I feel these principles ought to be upheld for all kids, no matter where they live. But obviously, it is certainly valid when we talk about the issues and the tasks of today of implementing effective learning practices for all of our children, particularly those in urban areas. So keeping in mind these 4 principles, I want to discuss the urgency of the need to change our ideas and our approaches to meeting the needs of our children. Let me briefly outline what I intend to do this morning. Number one, I want to begin by giving you my philosophical view of education, because it serves as the foundation for all of my thinking and my practice. Second, I want to make a case that we will need radical change in our current educational systems in order to meet the challenges presented to us by today's children and today's young people. And third, I will advocate for the development of learning organizations in order to facilitate learning for all of our children. Our systems of education must become learning organizations. And I will define what I mean by that and lay out some of the characteristics of such an organization. In terms of my own philosophy of education, there's a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And in the foreword of that book, a man named Richard Shaw lays out what is my philosophy. He says there is no such thing as a neutral educational process. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate the integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to it, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which young people are taught to deal critically and creatively with reality and to participate in the transformation of their world. So that to me, education is about freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. said that freedom is the capacity to deliberate or weigh alternatives. It is the ability to think, to make rational decisions about one's life. It is the capacity to accept responsibility for those decisions. So that I believe, in order to prepare our children to engage in the practice of freedom, it is clear that we must fundamentally and radically change the way we approach learning. I believe that our educational systems, particularly our public ones, are essentially organized to meet the needs and protect the interests of those of us who work in these systems, not the needs and interests of the children and the families that we are supposed to serve. And so I would argue that for the sake of our children, we must change. The only thing that is constant in the world is change. People, institutions, processes are always in the state of change, some for the better and some for the worse, but change is an ever-present reality. But far too many of us resist change, or we support change as long as nothing changes. It is this notion that we cannot face up to change. Isn't it amazing? Some of us stay in terrible personal and business situations knowing that it's terrible, but we just can't change. We just can't change. We just don't want to change. And I'm going to tell you, I belong to a group called the Leap Before You Look School. Because I think that if you look too long, you will never leap. And so many of us want to have every single question answered before we do anything different. And I would argue that those are the things that keep us from changing. And then when we finally do come to grips with change, we want to tinker around at the edges. We don't want to change our classroom totally. We just want to move the desks. We just want to do something a little bit different. Change the stuff on the bulletin board And that's all nice. But that's all tinkering around at the edges. And what I want to argue is that our children must have more. They deserve more. I believe that our kids need more than reform. They need and deserve a revolution, a radical transformation in our thinking and in our practice. And to help make this happen, I think we have to implement teaching and learning processes that help our children learn. In fact, I don't believe the issue is schooling. The issue is learning. And I would challenge you to read a book. It's hard to read. It's a book by a dude named Lewis Perlman out of Harvard. And it's called School's Out. And I would encourage teachers to read it. I had the great fortune of having one of my elementary schools read this book. And for staff development day, we went out and we sat in a circle for 2 hours and we discussed this book. And it's an interesting book because the first thing as teachers you have to get past is the part where he says that schools and teachers are obsolete. And that's why it's a hard book to read. After someone tells you you're obsolete, you close the book. But I'm saying don't close it, read it to understand why he would come to such a conclusion. And what I would argue is that what we need to know is what he says. And that is that our kids today can and will learn anytime, anywhere, any place. That given technology and a lot of other things that exist, our old ways of thinking about learning are not only obsolete, they're in the way. They're in the way of our children coming to new horizons in their own development. So I believe that our curriculum and our teaching and learning processes have to start helping our kids get to this future that is already here. Let me just suggest a couple things about curriculum and teaching and learning that are important in this whole process. Number one, I think our curriculums have to be multicultural. Now, I know that that may be now a politically incorrect, I'm not sure what's incorrect, correct, but what I do know is that it is impossible for kids to learn fully and never see themselves in the learning process. The fact of the matter is, America and the world don't belong to white people. That there's some other colors out here who have participated in the development of this world. And that it is crucial that as a part of learning, we bring these kids into that learning process. And people say, well, is it Afrocentric? Is it Eurocentric? It's all of those. In fact, the beauty of a multicultural perspective is it recognizes the contributions and the realities of all of us and incorporates that into the learning process. Secondly, I think that our curriculums ought to be, it ought to encourage problem solving. It ought to encourage like deep thinking. It ought to encourage teamwork. When I talk about this deep thinking and problem solving, I'm reminded of an article that I read during my dissertation. And you know, like all of you all in here who finish a dissertation, any of you who thinking about one, or in one, or whatever it is, you know, when you finally finish it, you don't want to see it. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I'm done. Let me put this somewhere. If I never see it again in life, it's cool with me. But I do remember this one article. And what she wrote was very interesting because she looked at different types of schools. And she called them ruling class schools and middle class schools and poor and working class schools. And what was really interesting is that in the poor and working class schools, we were having kids fill out the blank, circle the right answer. But then when you got to the ruling class schools, they were asking kids, what do you think about the world? Because what was happening was one group was being prepared to run the world, and another group was being prepared to take orders from those who run it. And I would argue that all of our children ought to be asked what they think. That all of our children ought to be brought into this notion that they can transform their world. And when you talk about teamwork, it's really interesting. I had 156 schools, and I visited every school. My first year as a superintendent, I stood up in front of my principals and announced I was going to do it in the first year. They were nice. They didn't laugh at me. I noticed they all looked down at the floor. So it took me 4 years. But I made it around to every single school. You know what's really interesting is that when you go into a kindergarten class, and this also is buttressed by this book I read called All I've Ever Learned, I Learned in Kindergarten. It's like those of you who teach kindergarten, you know, you go in there and the kids are on the rug and stuff. You get down on the rug with them, and they're working together. And they'll let you play with their beads and they'll snatch it from me, but they're working together. As soon as we get them in first grade, we line them up. Don't talk to nobody. Don't say nothing to nobody. Don't look at nobody. So all of a sudden, it becomes the antithesis of where the world is going. The world requires teamwork, and we require individual, look straight ahead, I'm the teacher. And so the reality of it is we have to change that. We also have to make sure that our kids are able to communicate orally, in writing. And this oral thing is a big thing. I spent a lot of time with kids. I did when I was a superintendent. I adopted a class. I kept up with them for 4 years because I didn't want to be held hostage away from kids. And I talked to kids a lot. And what I try to say to kids is, look, y'all have to be able to talk. You can't just say yo. Yo is all right, but that can't be the whole sentence. I mean, after you say yo, you got to tell me something after that. You can't spend a whole sentence saying, well, you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? No, I don't know what you're saying. Tell me what you're saying. Speak to me. And it's important that we help kids get those skills. And we have to concentrate. We have to work on that. At the same time, we have to ensure that kids use technology. And it is great that you all have new technology. On my way out the door, I spent every single surplus dollar that I could find on technology. You know why? Because for poor kids, the highway does not come through their neighborhoods unless we get it there. And you know what's real interesting is I work with one of these community organizations. They used to have these book drives. And all of a sudden, what's beginning to show up on the book drives is encyclopedias. You know why? Because people with money got computers in their homes and encyclopedias software. So they don't need these books anymore. So now these little poor kids finally getting some encyclopedias at a point in history when other people now have it on computers. And so we have to expose them to technology. And it's not enough just to have a computer in your room to point to when visitors come. The fact is, if you're going to get it in there, you better learn how to use it. Because our kids probably know more than many of you, and that's all right. Because that's my next point. And that is that in the teaching process, we must see ourselves as facilitators of learning, not the depositories of all knowledge. Because a teacher who thinks that he or she has to know everything doesn't know much about teaching. Because the fact of the matter is, on any given day, your students, if you recognize it, may know more than you know about certain things. But that's okay. Because we want to encourage that. We want to encourage active learners. You know, when I used to go visit schools, people used to say, well, how do you tell if it's a good school? And most people say it's a good school if it's quiet. But you know what I believe is if it's too quiet, that's a school where the teachers and the students done struck a deal. You don't say nothing, I won't say nothing. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying. And ain't nothing happening. But then if you go into a school where kids are active and they're involved in learning and there's an excitement to learning, that's because there's a teacher there who has connected to them. Because the interesting thing is you can go into a school building and you can walk into a room like that and then go right next door and there's death. In the same building, same kids, same mamas, same community, and the only difference is who's in the room with them and what the processes are that are being used in that room. So what I want to argue for is that we have to, in order to do this notion of transformation, we have to, number one, declare that the 2 by 4 by 6 by 9 by 12 paradigm is a bankrupt paradigm. This idea that all knowledge can be found between the 2 covers of a textbook, that it can all be done within the 4 walls of a classroom, what Perlman calls yak in the box. You get kids in there for 47 and a half minutes and you yak at them and think that learning is taking place. And that always leads us to the notion that, hey, I'm teaching, but they're not learning. Something wrong with them. Because I know I'm doing a hell of a job of teaching. They just not learning. So that, all of this can take place within the 4 walls. That it can all be done with 6 evenly spaced periods during the day. That it takes 9 months, and then after 12 years, we're going to declare them educated. That's a bankrupt, industrial age-bound paradigm. So that we have to, secondly, destroy this industrial age paradigm and replace it with an information age or a learning age paradigm. Now, what do I mean by a learning age paradigm? I believe that what's critical is turning systems and schools into learning organizations. There's a book by Peter Senge called The Fifth Discipline. I don't advise you to read it unless you got a lot of time, which you don't, because it's hard to get through. But those of you who want to get through it, it's very interesting because what Peter Senge does is to define a learning organization as one where people continually expand their capacity to create the results that they truly desire, where new and expansive patterns of thinking are nurtured, where collective aspiration is set free, and where people are continually learning how to learn together. So that I believe that we have to push to become a community of learners, and that the concept itself should represent a metaphor for the transformation of learning. We have to see the classroom as a community of learners, the school as a community of learners, the district as a community of learners, all taking place within the context of the McClemons community as a community of learners. In a learning organization dedicated to helping our children develop learning tools, the teaching and learning process remains a complex issue. Because not only does teaching require constant judgment calls, but also matters of the heart are involved in the expectations that we adults hold for students as well as for ourselves. It is critical for the adults to facilitate the creation of a learning environment that motivates, inspires, and encourages intellectual risk-taking that is necessary for learning to take place. For deep and lasting, as well as ongoing change to occur, we have to change how people interact in the process of learning. At the same time, we must rigorously examine our own attitudes towards teaching and learning, particularly when it comes to non-white children and poor children. Now let me talk directly here about a point that I believe deeply. A book that Debbie encouraged me to read, and I would encourage all men to read, and some women too, is called Return to Love by Marianne Williamson. And what she says is, there is a deep psychological connection between your attitude towards people and their capacity for transformation. Until you love people, you can never understand them. And if you do not understand them and respect them, then you cannot teach them. And so I want to say that if you don't love these children, you don't respect these children, do everybody a favor. Get a different occupation. Now, that's a cold-blooded thing to say, but it is even more cold-blooded. And I used to tell all my beginning teachers at the beginning of the year, look, there's nothing wrong with admitting that you made a mistake. The worst thing in the world is to know that you don't care about these kids, but you stay there and you destroy them day after day after day. Ain't nothing wrong with saying, I thought I want to be a teacher, but now that I look at these kids, I realize I want to sell cars, or I want to do, whatever it is. And I'm serious about that. And there's nothing wrong with that. You could become all kinds of things, but don't stay there and destroy our kids because you hate them. Now, people say, well, how could a teacher stay and hate kids? It happens every day in America. And what's crucial is that all of y'all know the ones that hate the kids, and you don't have enough courage to run them the hell out of your school. Now, I told you, I'm coming down front. This ain't about trying to fix this, because it's past time to be fixing this while people are destroying our children. So I want to say that we need to help create these learning organizations. In Milwaukee, I argued that we needed to reconceptualize our views about a school system. I believe that we ought to move, and this again may not apply to you because of the size, but in a place like Milwaukee, Detroit, Debbie was running Detroit with 240 schools, my view is that we should not have school systems, we should have a system of schools. And let me tell you what the difference is, because it's not semantical. A system of schools is an organizational structure that uses decentralized and shared decision-making, that encourages substantial change and innovation, that embraces diversity, that achieves continuous improvement, and is held accountable for student achievement. Now, let me talk briefly about each one of those. Decentralized and shared decision-making. See, I believe that all of the crucial decisions about a school ought to be made at the school by the school community. That the budget decisions, the personnel decisions, the curriculum decisions need to be made at the schools. And that we need to involve principals and teachers and parents and students and aides and engineers. All of the people who make up the school community have to be involved in the decision-making about the school. That the board ought to be a board that sets policy, that sets standards, and then free people up to meet those standards. We have to get away from this whole structure where even in a place like Milwaukee, on a given day, in one school, in one classroom, one parent can get mad about one thing that happened to his or her child, and before you know it, we got a rule that affects 155 other schools. And people trying to figure out, where did this come from? Because this system that we have set up is an industrial age system. I believe that the central office, whatever its size, it ought to be created to support schools, not the other way around. And that when a call is made, people are calling you not because they don't have anything else to do. They're calling you because they want you to help them resolve a problem. And so that, in fact, if we're going to have these central offices, they need to be problem-solving, technical assistance entities, not directing entities. And one of the worst things is when people call you and they ask you for help, and you don't know what to do, but somebody told you because you're there, you're supposed to know what to do. So I'm going to share with you this thing that Debbie gave me. There's something that I don't know that I'm supposed to know. I don't know what it is I don't know, and yet I am supposed to know. And I feel and I look stupid if I seem both not to know it and not know what it is I don't know. Therefore, I pretend I know it. And this is nerve-wracking since I don't know what I must pretend to know. Therefore, I pretend to know everything. So this type of customer-focused entity, that my job is to serve my customers. If you're in a central office, your customers are the schools. Your customers are the parents. Your customers are the kids. These are the people we're supposed to serve. Substantial change and innovation. You have to talk about systemic change. As I said, you can't just tinker around at the edges. When I look at school districts around this country, it becomes clear to me that there are some current practices that are not broken and do not need to be fixed. In fact, people are good at throwing it up in your face. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's an interesting concept. First of all, many people who talk about it ain't broke, their problem is they don't know that it's broke, which is a deep problem in itself. But let's assume for a moment that it's not broke. I would say replace that industrial age paradigm, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, with a cutting edge philosophy that says, if it ain't broke, improve it before it gets broken. That is a different way of looking at the world. But at the same time that I would say that there are things that we need to build on, there are some policies and practices that do not need to be reformed. They need to die. They need to be killed so that new schools of the future can emerge. Now, what are some of these things? Well, there was this report from 1991 by the National Association of Secondary School Principals. They shadowed some 8th graders for a day. Now, this is not me. This is what they said, these experts. They said that from their one day, they found that departmentalization dominated, that schedules were rigid, that content coverage was almost the entire focus of instruction, and passive learning prevails, and that the lack of involvement and interaction by students made the school day doubly tiring and boring, not only to the kids, but to the observers. Now, think about this. Let's just look at it, bell schedules. I mean, why do we have some of these bell schedules? They have no connection to time that kids need to learn. Why do we have them? You have to go back to understand the history of American education. Why do we have bells? Because we had this monolithic, bureaucratic, industrial age paradigm that said everybody's supposed to be at their places when the bell rings. And we are all supposed to stay at our places and do piecework, which is what was happening in the Industrial Revolution. It was all about discipline for the working class. We have to now ask ourselves, should we keep this? What about centralized contracts and administrative procedures and board rules and statewide mandates that force all of us to be the same? I know I'm getting ready to step on some toes, but I'm sorry. This idea that you belong in a building because you've been there the longest, that is insane. I mean, whether you got anything to do with the kids or not, hell, I've been here. And you all know teachers who like that. They have squatters' rights to the building. It has nothing to do with whether or not they right for the building, right for the kids. I've been here. I'm sorry. We need to throw that stuff out and ask the question of what does your being here bring to the kids who are here? And that's tough because people say, well, you're trying to attack the foundations of our union and this and that. Hey, I'm sorry. It ain't about your union. It's about these kids. And it is about what we have to do to meet the needs of these kids and how you can change what you've done and what we've set up to do this. And I know these are tough issues, but I just have to say that we have to look at these things. And as Peter Drucker, a management theorist, said, there's nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. And Einstein made this observation about insanity. He said that insanity is the tendency to do what you've always done, but to expect different results. And so what I'm arguing is we have to have a different paradigm, substantial change and innovation, diversity. Two things, quickly. Two things about diversity: race, ethnic, and class diversity. And then the second thing is diversity in our educational practices and procedures. First, race, ethnicity, and class. The thing we have to do is we have to respect and celebrate diversity. I always worry when I hear people talk about the problem we have because we have so many of those kids. Which kids are you talking about? The black ones, the brown ones, the poor ones? Which ones are we talking about? I would argue that we have to celebrate diversity of our students and build on it. We have to celebrate diversity in our staffs. But you know, when you celebrate diversity, you then have to change. It's like when a new person comes into the family, you can't just have all of the change on the new person. The family now has to change. The way it operated to welcome the new person into the family. And so we have to understand this diversity. And we also have to understand that when you poor in America, you do not have the same ability to attach your hand to the levers of power. That having money in America does make a difference. And in fact, the only people in America that will tell you that money doesn't make a difference are people with money. No poor people will announce to you, hey, this is great, with no money. And so that the point I'm making is that when you got money in America, it improves your life chances every day. And so what we have to understand is that our kids who are poor don't have that same level of resources. But I want to make a clear argument that you cannot use the fact that kids are poor as an excuse not to teach them, as an excuse not to help them learn. So that's celebrating this diversity. And then there is the diversity of the notion that there is no one best system, a book I read by Tyack called One Best System. And I want to just briefly say on that I believe we need to have all kinds of themes, all kinds of instructional strategies, all kinds of educational philosophies, all kinds of governance arrangements. I believe in charter schools. I believe in partnerships. I believe in public-private partnerships. And I want to take this moment here to offer my congratulations and respect to McClemons, to the superintendent, to the board, to the union, to the parents, and to the community for being willing to enter into a partnership with Edison. See, I think that we have to be willing to do whatever we can do to change what is happening with our kids. And we need to try all kinds of different things, not to destroy public education, but to save it. And I'm a supporter, so everybody knows, of choice. People say, how can you support choice? Here's why I support choice. I support choice because people with money in America every day make choices. The people who can't make choices are people who don't have no money. And so the choice program in Milwaukee is set up to give poor people the opportunity to make a choice. And I believe that if we're good, and good as we say we are, why would we worry about choice? Because if our schools are good, and we have many of them that are, people will choose us. And for those of us who know we're not doing what we ought to be doing, it ought to be a wake-up call to you. That if you don't deal with these kids, not only are the kids going to leave, but they're going to take the money with them. And when the money goes, maybe people will wake up and take notice. Because you and I know that in school systems all over America, we march kids into death every year. We march them into buildings where ain't nobody learned in 20 years. And when you put them in there, you know they're not going to learn, but they're going in there anyway. And then we want to say, yeah, but if you give people choice, it'll hurt the system. Question is, who are we for? The kids or the system? In a city like Milwaukee, what's interesting is some 30% or more of public school teachers put their children in private schools. And that's okay, because they ought to have that right. I just want poor people to have that same right. And then finally, let me just talk a minute about accountability. I'll skip continuous improvement. Just go to accountability. And there's this book, We Must Take Charge, by Chester Finn. He has the best definition that I've ever seen of accountability. What he says is that accountability in any endeavor today means that specified goals or outcomes are supposed to be achieved and that people throughout the organization are responsible for achieving them. Not just for following procedures, but for achieving outcomes, student outcomes. The purpose of an accountability system is not punishment or retribution. Accountability systems aren't criminal justice systems. And we don't build them because we want to be vengeful. We construct them because we want good results. And in the world we live in, there's a greater likelihood of producing good results if consequences follow from success or failure. You cannot have change if kids don't learn and nothing happens. So that in a good accountability system, there's a tripod. You have clearly stated goals, you have an information system that tells you how well you're doing to reach those goals, and then you have consequences, either positive or negative. Why should you do an excellent job with your kids and nothing happens? And if you do a bad job, nothing happens. Nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. That has to change. Now, I know I put a lot on you all this morning, and I'm just about through. I just want you to feel the same urgency that I feel, because every day we're losing thousands of our kids. And we're losing kids that we do not have to lose. And I want to interject a point here. I know that there are conditions facing our children outside of schools that have a direct and critical impact on their preparation for learning, their attitude towards learning. I'm talking about poverty, the fact that kids lack resources. And some of you all know, and I don't know your community very well, but I looked at the data, and I know that there's some of your kids who are living hard. In fact, we got kids who ought to get a medal, elementary school kids, who ought to get a medal just for showing up to school. They're taking care of their siblings, they're taking care of themselves, they're taking care of their parents. You know, and it's hard. And they have difficult lives. Some of them, before I was the superintendent, I was the head of the Department of Human Services for Milwaukee County. And I went out with child abuse workers, and we went into homes at 3 o'clock in the morning where there was no food, no furniture, feces all over the wall, no adults. So I know what's happening with our children. There are children who have no parental guidance whatsoever. And in fact, some of you are the only caring, loving, nurturing adult that these kids will see in a given day. You are it. You shouldn't be, but you're it. And then there's the mental and physical violence that our kids see and experience all too often. So I believe that we have to fight those issues as well, that we have to fight to have a children's agenda, because schools cannot solve all of the problems that face our children. But at the same time that I'm saying that, I know and you know that there are individual educators, individual classrooms, individual schools who are successfully educating these very kids. And that these issues that I'm talking about, these issues that these kids bring, this is the reason why we must change. Because so many of us are still teaching kids who used to be there, kids we wish were there, but not the kids who are actually there. And teachers used to tell me, well, Howard, I could do a better job if I had better kids. But as Superintendent Fraser said, these are the best kids that they got. These are the kids. But you know what it is? It's like, and the only way I know how to do it, and I use this terminology because I'm a disc jockey, but it's like we're dealing with a hip-hop generation with a waltz mentality. And we're trying to figure out, like, why it don't connect. Why? I have a perfect classroom here that I love. Why are they not learning? We have excellent rules here that work for all of us. Why is it that it don't work for them? And so what I'm trying to get you to do is to see that we can reach these children. We can reach these children if we believe in them. So in the final analysis, it's a question of our political will. We can change if we believe it is important enough to do so. We can create learning organizations for all of our children. To do so, we must develop this creative tension between what is and where we must go. We can empower ourselves to change the current framework. We can move beyond the crisis, the pressure, the limitations, and together make something different. We must be willing to get people to understand the systemic forces that shape change, and then we have to fight for it. I believe we can build a community of learners all over America by exercising a leadership that refuses to be bound by what is, and because what is simply does not work for too many of our children. It only works for a few of us. And it doesn't work for so many of them. So I leave you today with the words of William Daggett, and I believe this in all my heart. We must love our children's hopes, dreams, and prayers more than we love the institutional heritage of the school system. Thank you very much.